Good evening or morning to those in Hong Kong, and thank you all for joining us. I am
Yes.
Sebastian Burka, the Associate Director of the Stigler Center, and today we are happy to host Mr. Jimmy Lai and Professor Stephen Davis for a webinar in our series, Freedom of Speech, Hong Kong and the Future of US-China Relations. The series was created to facilitate conversations among leading scholars and experts about the implications of the ongoing events in Hong Kong for freedom of speech, US-China relations, and beyond. Before we begin, please note that we are on the record and we will post the video on our YouTube channel later. If you have questions for the speakers, we will address them in the last 15 minutes or so. You can submit them via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. As usual, views expressed by guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. We hope that you will join us for more upcoming webinars on the Hong Kong topic and others, so please check our website, our publication, promarket.org, and our Capitalism podcast, hosted by our faculty director, Luigi Zingales, and investigative journalist, Bethany McLean. Back to today, you can find more information on the event page, but please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. Mr. Jimmy Lai is a Hong Kong-based entrepreneur and founder of media company Next Digital, which operates the newspaper Apple Daily. And Professor Stephen Davis is the William Abbott Distinguished Service Professor of International Business and Economics at Chicago Booth. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian, and welcome to everybody who's tuned in. Jimmy, thank you so much for joining us. It's a privilege and a pleasure to speak with you. We're very grateful for your time. You are a longtime critic of the Chinese Communist Party, and I would like to give just a brief thumbnail sketch of your early life to set up my first question. So you were born in Guangzhou, China in December 1948. That means you were about 9 or 10 years old at the start of the so-called Great Leap Forward. That was a desperate time in China. Millions died from starvation and violence. At age 12, you fled to Macau, and from there smuggled yourself into Hong Kong on a boat. You started working in a garment factory, and over time rose to become factory manager. As I understand it, in 1975 or so, at age 26, you invested your year-end bonus in stocks. Stocks did well. You used the proceeds when you sold the stocks to buy a garment factory. You expanded your business empire over time. In 1981, you established Giordano, which folks in Asia know very well. It grew into a major clothing chain with 2,000 shops in 30 countries. So before the age of 40, you were a very successful businessman. You were rich. And then came the spring 1989 protests in mainland China and the Tiananmen Square massacre. As I understand it, those events had a profound effect on you and the course of your life. Can you tell us how?
Well, because when the June 4th massacre happened, I thought that there's no way China is going to reverse its path to liberalization. And at the time I was 40, I thought the best business to go into is the media, because by delivering information, you deliver liberty. And for young businessmen to devote the rest of his life delivering liberty is something, I can't have a better choice in life. And that's why I started a magazine called Next Magazine, which became the overnight success. And then in 1995, I started the Apple Daily newspaper, which also became, the second biggest in a very short time. And then we started a newspaper and magazine, the same format in Taiwan, and we had the same success. The reason I start in Taiwan is to make sure that we have leverage in Taiwan, just in case after the Chinese take over, we will have trouble. So the leverage in Taiwan will give us some protection. And that's the whole story.
I see. So you've been in the media business for 30 years. You started
Right.
out in part because you saw it as a way to promote liberty and freedom, free
Right.
expression of ideas.
Right.
How have your views evolved about the role of the media in that regard over the past 30 years? I mean, or maybe you still have the same view, but I presume that you've learned a few things along the way.
Well, I have the same will. Just because I'm involved in opposition newspaper or media that graduate, I involved with the democratic movement. And it is a known fact that I've been donating money to the democratic parties and supporting the parties, but not the movement. You know, I never put money in any movement, but I support the several democratic parties.
Okay, and so you've also played a very prominent role, at least in recent years, in expressing your views about the conduct of the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party, and you've expressed these views forcefully in Western media. And I'd like to just draw attention to an article that you wrote in the New York Times in July 2019, and the article said, was titled, "What the Hong Kong Protests Are Really About." And you said the Chinese government saw the protests, and here I'm quoting, as the first salvo in a Cold War, one in which otherwise unarmed Hong Kong people wield the most powerful weapon in the fight against the Communist Party, moral force. You went on to say that in much of the West, we underestimate moral force, but you say communists never make that mistake. So tell us what you mean by moral force and why you think it's so powerful.
Well, I think the reason why the West has such a long peace is the underlying values that we share. You know, the Chinese the CCP, instead trying to assert their own value, which is artificial. You know, they want to assert their dictatorial value to replace the Western system. I think that's where the danger is. The so-called new Cold War actually is about conflicting values. You know, otherwise the US would not have started the trade war with China, just because China share very different values which conflicted with the value of the West, and that's how it transpired into a trade war eventually. You know, whether the Chinese, you know, they force the transfer of technology, you know, they don't abide, you know, the contractual obligations, all that kind of things just manifest a different values. That's what, therefore, different behavior in dealings in the international arena.
So if I understand you correctly, you are saying that the different Chinese values won't stay in China, but they will affect the rest of the world, and that they'll create conflicts that we need to be concerned about in the West. Is that your view?
Definitely. No, well, that's you know, when I wrote that article, the pandemic was not there yet. But from the pandemic, you know that, you know, it has confirmed what I said is true. If the Chinese first discover the virus and would have stopped people traveling and informed the world of what happened instead of cover up and deception, the world would have been safe of all this trouble, all these disasters, all this loss of life and money and all that. So this is a proof that because of sharing different values, their behavior is so contrast to our exact behavior in the West or in the free world.
But But explain that to me more fully, because we have cover up sometimes in the West too. But
Yeah.
your argument seems to be that there's something intrinsic to the Chinese system that promotes cover-ups in response to bad news, and that in the case of the pandemic played out in a way that was bad for China but bad for the whole world. So
Right.
can you explain that more fully, that connection you see between the system and the cover-up that happened and the harm that followed from the cover-up?
Well, if you don't have an abiding values that you share with the world, whatever you do it for political expedience, for whatever you need to do, whatever you try to win a deal or to get what you want, without observing the rules and orders which the values are underlying. That's where the conflict comes from. The world is peaceful, that I travel anywhere, that I have no conflict with anybody. It's not just because the world is originally a peaceful place, which is not. Just because we share the value, a lot of those we don't even understand what it is. That's the reason that we follow it, and everybody can live and deal with each other peacefully and harmoniously. And that's where the value is. The whole value system is the evolution from the Western civilization. Today we have the rule of law. Today we have the private property rights, the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom of assembly. All that kind of institutions are not man-made, but those are values we evolve in trial and errors over the years. So this is so-called values. Nobody made it. Nobody knows how to design it. Now the CCP wants to assert their own value and system to replace it. And that's where the conflict comes.
So Jimmy, I hear you making multiple points in those remarks, and let me try to summarize them to make sure I understand. First, we shouldn't be complacent about the largely peaceful world we live in today, because that's the state of affairs we've grown accustomed to, but it's not necessarily always that way. Right. Second point is freedom of expression, property rights, and so on. They are important values in creating a world in which we can peacefully travel and interact with one another.
Yeah.
Third point is that set of values and the system that we enjoy today is something that grew up over decades and centuries.
Right.
And we should take care of it carefully, because it can be undermined. And I think that's your fourth point. You see the values that animate the Chinese Communist Party as being deeply in conflict with that system, and in that way presenting a threat to the rest of the world.
Yes. I think the West has become complacent because all the politicians, they need to have a good economy, and all the big companies, all that, they need profit. So they don't care about the value, or they care about money making. That complacence has created what we are facing, the China we are facing today. Because after we defeat Soviet Union, we had no more enemies. So we became complacent and overlooked the importance of the value which has made us great and the world peaceful.
So Jimmy, I want to go back to this idea of moral force. It's connected to the remarks you just made, I think, but you can tell me if I'm wrong. So in this same New York Times article that I quoted from before, you said moral force makes communists insecure. And I would like you to elaborate on that, but also, is that sense of insecurity the reason why there's hostility in the Chinese Communist Party towards political freedom in Hong Kong? Or is there something else?
Well, I think they're insecure in the sense that they don't have it. They don't understand it. They don't understand the importance of values. You can see that they have no regard for law. They have no sense of they have no legal sense. And that's why, because they don't share the value. They don't have the value underlying the understanding of the importance of the rule of law.
Do you think they understand the values and reject them, or they just don't understand them?
Well, I think they understand the danger of the value.
I see.
The Western value, but they can't understand how powerful this value is. Or maybe they understand the power, the power of the value, and that's why they're so insecure about it. Because they cannot assert themselves into this value. If they share our value, the totalitarian regime, the idea of changing the world, changing human nature and all that will be bankrupt. For the CCP, what they want to do, they want to change the world by changing people's human nature. When you want to change human nature, you're overlooking the values which underlying the nature of the people.
You mean, which part of human nature? You mean a desire to speak freely, a desire to live one's life as one sees fit, or do you have something else in mind?
Well, if the human nature as it goes unbridledly, you will create chaos. Our human nature is so civilized that we can deal with each other in a harmonious way just because subtly we all share a moral code and the values which the institutions of rule of law, freedom of speech, private property right, and all the institutions that gave us the protection has groomed us. This underlying value that we just act naturally.
So, Jimmy, I want to ask you about something that strikes me as a tension in two aspects of your thinking.
Right.
One point you've already made very clearly is that you think that the Chinese Communist Party, the leaders in Beijing, see Western values as a danger.
Right.
Okay. But then, you've also written, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that part of what the struggle that you're involved in Hong Kong for political freedoms is about is a desire to help the Chinese authorities appreciate the strength of moral admiration from the rest of the world, and to try to get them to acquire influence through moral admiration rather than the barrel of a gun. But if they see this big danger from Western values, then how will you get them to go down this path? And then, correct me if I'm wrong, that's your goal ultimately. It's a breathtaking ambition, but you want to persuade them to take a different path in how they accumulate influence in the rest of the world. So if I got it right, and if I do, how do you resolve the tension between those two elements of your thinking?
Well, we are fighting for our rule of law and freedom here because we share the Western value because of the legacy of our past British colonial time. So the way we fight for our rule of law and freedom, we become the beacon of the Western value to express, to spread it or to express it or manifest it into our, in our fight against CCP. And hopefully that kind of value is also recognized by the Chinese people in China. And that's why how we become a beacon of this value And that's what I always say, that we are actually in the frontier of this new Cold War, because we share your value and we are fighting in the front line with your value against a dictator value.
So here again, I hear you saying several things. Let me try to summarize. On one point is you hope that Hong Kong, the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, really Hong Kong's history of political liberties,
Right.
freedom of expression, can serve as an example
Right.
that persuades at least some people in mainland China.
Right.
But second, I think you use this word beacon, which is, a very vivid image. And I think you're trying to shine a light or draw attention to the struggle you are facing, but also the nature of the Chinese Communist Party regime in mainland China, and alert the rest of the world. Hey, have I got it right?
Yes, yes, yes.
I'll see.
Yes. And because if the Chinese, they can assimilate into the Western value and the order, it will be great for the world, and it will be greater for China.
Yes, I was just going to say, great for China as well.
Yeah, it will be greater for China, because China is definitely going to be the biggest, and the most powerful economically in the world. If they continue to assert their value in dealing with the outside world, the outside world will never have peace. And they will have very difficult time dealing with the outside world. Whatever they deal with the outside world will be very expensive. The transaction cost of them dealing with the outside world will be increased, which is no good for China, because the world is going to resist the behavior they feel, they feel conflicting. They feel uncomfortable, because the way the Chinese behavior has become such offenses to the sense of decency to the free world people. And that's why the whole free world now turned against China, because they feel so uncomfortable the way they deal with the outside world. Let's put NBA. The way that they make NBA to kowtow to them, the American people, they feel that they're being insulted. The way that Disneyland kowtow to China, I think the American people also see it as disgrace. So this is the offense. The American people feel that the sense of decency is being offended.
I'm sure that's true for many Americans, but you also referenced, the power of commercial incentives. There's American companies and organizations like the NBA who recognize that mainland China is an enormous market. The Chinese use that as leverage in their efforts to quiet dissent, both by businesses, foreign businesses operating inside China, but even more broadly in the world at large. I want to get your sense of the following. I suspect there are listeners tonight, and there are certainly people around the world who, when they hear you speak, they have one of two reactions. One, as long as we let the Chinese do what they want in their own country, it's not going to be that much of a danger to the rest of the world. So what do you say to people who have that attitude? What's your response?
Well, what they do internally definitely have no effect on the outside world, but what they do internally, the same value, is inevitable that they will carry it to the outside world. we have to understand that capitalism is not about just making money. Capitalism works just because underlying the capitalist system, there's values. Whether the value of our obligation or commitment to contract, the value of our respect for private property, the value of freedom of speech, because in business, you also need criticism, which makes you reflect and improve. A capitalism does not improve. It's not a capitalism. A capitalism can only improve through competitions. Competition includes freedom of speech.
But that's an argument about why the Chinese, for their own interest, should adopt a more open system. Because criticism leads to self-improvement. It helps one identify mistakes.
Exactly.
It brings good ideas to the fore, so we can make improvements. But why in the rest of the world should we be so concerned about what happens in Hong Kong or what happens in mainland China? So suppose you encounter somebody who agrees with all your criticisms of the way the Chinese Communist Party operates in mainland China and what they're doing in Hong Kong. But they say, you know what? It's Chinese territory. We don't like it. We can't do anything about it. We just have to let them do what they want. As long as it stays in China, it's bad for China. It's not great for the rest of the world, but so what? I can go on living my life. What do you say to people who have that view?
Well,
I think there are a lot of people who view.
But the fact is not that. That's why America started a trade war with China, just because their behavior. They cannot avoid carrying their own value to usher into the world using their powerful economic power.
I see.
The way they treat Hong Kong, they tear up the basic law. They promise universal suffrage that never came. They use the national security law overriding our rule of law. All this disregard for the judiciary system. They don't have a sense of law. And this reflects what kind of CCP is to the world. And what we are fighting for will be what the world has to fight for, or is already fighting. That's why there's a new Cold War. The new Cold War is not about hot war. It's not about military power, although at the back of it is very important. It's about conflicting values.
So Jimmy,
that's why last time the West won over Russia without finding a short.
So
just because the value won.
I heard you say something very important, and I want to make sure I got it right. So I'm going to put it in different words, but you tell me if I've got it right. There are many countries around the world where the regimes don't operate in a way that respects Western values. But you're saying that in China's case, because they've become such an economic powerhouse, that it won't be possible to contain that antithetical value system within China, that there's going to inevitably be conflicts with the rest of the world unless there's some reform of the Chinese system.
Right, exactly.
If I got it.
If you are Iran, even you are very close. When you deal with the outside world, you want to make a deal, you have to abide to the outside world's rule. The economic power of Iran is very small. But if you're China, you have 1.4 billion people as a market and a very powerful economic power. You can actually assert your value with the economic interest that is putting in front of the world. or somebody who wants to make money.
I see. So that's what distinguishes China from
Exactly,
other
and that's where the danger is.
like
You
Iran.
know, if it is any other country, with small country, whatever value they have, when they come out to deal with the world, they have to do according to the world. You know, they have no other choice. But China has another choice because China is so powerful.
I see.
That's why the world is so irritated.
So let me try a different argument on you and get your response. You know, China has a long history of centralized control and then things falling apart, either for internal reasons or often because of external powers that oppressed China or invaded China. And I sense when I talk to Chinese nationals who are friends that many of them put extreme value on stability. Above all else, they want the Chinese government to be stable and sufficiently strong enough to maintain stability within China.
Right.
And so they're willing to compromise other values in order to support what they see as the underpinnings of stability.
Yeah.
And if that involves a strong CCP, so be it. So I think some people, many people, even though they're sympathetic to the values that you and I hold dear, nevertheless say, you know what, there are other important issues on the table. The most important thing is to maintain political stability within China. And that means, at least for the foreseeable future, the Communist Party operating as it has. What's your response to that?
Well, for China to keep this stability, they must have an international harmonious environment. Now the U.S. is turned against them, and the European countries are also joining the U.S. The whole world become hostile and look at China as a common enemy. How stable your country is when the outside world is looking at you as an enemy. The only long-term stability for China is for them to assimilate into the international community's value.
I see.
You know, because
I see. So
yeah,
your argument is
China cannot become an island and be stable. That happened in the 15th century when Chiang Kai, he had the most advanced boat ships went out around the world and came back and told the emperor that the outside world is barbaric. So the emperor decided there's nothing we can learn from the outside world. So they cut it, and from then on, they banned all the construction of big boats, which can go overseas. And from there on, China has become backward until 40 years ago, they reopened to the world again. So they can't live as an island. They have to live with the constant interactions with the outside world to keep the stability and advance in terms of the world advance.
So that's an interesting perspective, and I share your view that China has benefited enormously, commercially and in other ways, from its interactions with the rest of the world, and I think from having a market-oriented Hong Kong as an example, and yet nevertheless, the political dynamics within the communist system don't seem to either not recognize that, but that's not the overriding concern. There's still a desire to make Hong Kong conform to mainland China. So I still trying to understand why, in your view, there's this overriding desire among the leadership in Beijing to make Hong Kong conform, which is how I interpret the developments in recent years, and including the national security law. So why don't they recognize the force of the argument you just made and say, you know what, it's good for us to have this place called Hong Kong that's actually an opening to ideas and commercial practices from the rest of the world, even if we don't want to let it spread. Why doesn't that argument resonate with Beijing?
Well, the other argument is, if you let Hong Kong people fighting for the rule of law and freedom, which is the core of the Western value, which could spread to China, the longer we fight, the more the Chinese people will recognize the supremacy of this value system, because it's human nature to aspire for freedom. So this is a very dangerous idea for them.
I see. So even as
keeping Hong Kong free.
So even as
very important for Chinese, especially now, you see that the sanctions of the American technology and chips towards China, and I think the Western countries, the Japan and all that, will have to follow, which has done really great damage to the Chinese economy. You know, even to their technology startups, because technology research depends on other technology complementary to support it, to test it and all that. No technology research is isolated. So now, without the technology, chips, all the information, the people going to China, China's technology development will be suffocated. They could have all this sanctions, technology, chips, and all that people information still open to them if they still keep Hong Kong open to the world. And without America revoked our special status. Now, even Hong Kong is shut out from the world. They have no way to get what they are being sanctioned.
I mean, one thing about that argument puzzles me. It seems to me that Hong Kong, as an exemplar to people in mainland China, was much more powerful 20, 30, 40 years ago, when it was not only freer than mainland China, but also much richer. Yeah. And of course, on average, it still is richer, but there are many parts of China now, major cities, which have living standards that no longer look so different, and maybe in some cases they're even better than Hong Kong. So in that sense, Hong Kong's luster as something for Beijing to fear, as an example, has diminished. So why now then, if it's a less attractive alternative, at least economically, why is now the time when they're crushing?
Because now the whole world is turning against China. If you keep Hong Kong as a window, you still have the way out to the outside world and let the outside world in. They now even shut the window. We would have become the window, even if the whole world turned against China. And that window now is closed.
Okay. Well, there are other open windows. There are Chinese students studying abroad. There are people who get beyond the so-called Chinese firewall to read things that are written in the rest of the world. It still strikes me as a bit of a puzzle that Hong Kong seems to loom in the minds of the Beijing authorities as a larger threat now,
right,
than it did a generation ago. But maybe I'm just missing something. Jimmy, I want to ask you about another thing. So you wrote another article in the New York Times this year. I didn't get a chance to ask you as much about it, but you do issue something of a clarion call, I would say, in that article, to the barbarians in the West, using the term, the old-fashioned term, the barbarians outside China. You issue something of and you didn't use that word. I'm using that word now.
Okay.
Just make that clear. But you did say that we, and you're referring to the struggle for political freedoms in Hong Kong, we need the support of the West, especially the United States. So I want to ask you, given you pose that question, what kind of support would you like to see from the US government now? And what would you like to see from individuals and organizations who are sympathetic to the values that you espouse?
Well, if I spell out what I'd like to see, I'll be violating the national security law.
Okay, well,
the police will be on my doorstep very soon. But I think that what is most important is for the American people to always pay attention to what happened here and voice out their reassurance about what they think and support us. Because Hong Kong is got such a attention from the world because we share their value and they have a very vivid resonance with us. And that resonance can get them to pay more attention to us, to voice out more for us. And if people voice out for us, the politician will have to come forward to do the same thing. And that's what is going to be very important. Our only saving grace is for the world to pay attention to us and voice out in support of us, because they find it very important that Hong Kong sharing their value is not being crammed down. Because if Hong Kong is crammed down, that has a damage to the credibility of the Western values. That has that damage the credibility and the integrity of the West in protecting their own values.
So you're looking for us to pay attention to what's happening in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
You're looking for those of us who are sympathetic to political freedoms in Hong Kong to express that support verbally.
Right.
And you're also saying, look, if Hong Kong is crushed, that's a setback for Western values. And when I say Hong Kong's crushed, I mean the system of free expression, political liberty, rule of law, independent judiciary that has characterized Hong Kong in much of the recent decades.
Right.
I got it right?
Well, yeah, we are in the forefront fighting for your values. If you let your value defeat in the frontier, that may spread to all the rest. All the other country needs American support will be very disappointed. Those countries they share the same value, they need the American support will be very disappointed. That credibility once lost, it's going to be a great loss for the American power.
So it's not just about Hong Kong itself. It's every other frontier place in the world where people are fighting for political liberties, the freedom to express themselves, limited government rule of law. You're saying it'll be a setback for all those folks as well.
Right.
I see. Jimmy, let me turn to some questions here, and I'm going to take a quick look at them. So I've got a question here, which I suspect is on the minds of many. So let me ask it. It says, what are your thoughts on Taiwan-Chinese relations? What's the most likely path forward for the next 10 years? Status quo, reunification with China, or Taiwan independence?
Well, the unification of China is not possible because the majority of the Taiwanese, they don't want it. I think the status quo is also not likely because you can see that America are upgrading Taiwan's status and upgrading this military support for Taiwan independence is not possible because independence will actually start a war with China. You know, I don't think the US wants it. I don't think the Chinese wants it, but the Chinese would have no alternative but to start a war if Taiwan openly proclaimed independence. I don't think that the US would allow that. You know, the US definitely would make sure that the condition the US will support Taiwan to whatever Taiwan needs protection is on the condition that they don't proclaim independence.
So a continuation of the status quo is the best.
But upgrade the status, upgrades, you know, the military power of Taiwan to protect itself with the support of the US military power behind it. I think this is what's going to happen, because it's very important for the US to keep Taiwan. If the US lost Taiwan, the US will lose the credibility to its allies in Asia. If the US loses the credibility of the allies in Asia, the US will lose Asia, which is going to be the biggest market for the US and the most dynamic economic arena in the world in future. That's why the US pivot to Asia. They have to come back to Asia. I think the US will increase their presence more and more in Asia, because all the neighboring countries in Asia to China, they want a greater American presence to keep them safe from the barricades of the Chinese regime.
I see. So yeah, there's no doubt that Asia is the most dynamic part of the global economy. Has been and probably will be for quite some time. Right. Yeah, the U.S. since World War II has underpinned the security order in that part of the world for the most part. And I guess it's hard to know what would happen. At least it seems hard to me to know what would happen if Taiwan became absorbed into the People's Republic of China. It would be. I understand. I understand the argument about credibility. Yeah. And then the question is, well, how would Japan, how would South Korea, how would other Asian countries respond? And, I think they've already been reassessing the reliability of the United States as an ally, even aside from that in recent years. You know, and that is worrisome.
No, I think the Trump administration is reasserting it.
Okay.
You know, they realize how important it is now, because with the stronger China, the clearer America knows the importance of Asia, and Asia can only sustain its peace if there's a stronger American presence here.
Well, let's hope that we maintain peace.
I'm sure they will.
That would be it's a nightmare to contemplate the alternatives.
Right.
Let me look at the questions again, Jimmy, and see what we have here. I'll get a little closer to the screen, maybe take off my glasses so that I can read them. So here's a question. It says, the collective system of values that has come to be accepted, I think that's referring to China, has grown through centuries of Western global domination. So, and I presume it's a so this is the idea that China and people's values are a reaction to the actions of the West in recent centuries. And then the questioner goes on to say, do you think that the rejection of these values, that is Western values, as I understand it, is a reaction to this hegemony and a desire to create something new?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. They want to use their economic power to assert their values and the system to replace the international system.
But I understand the questioner to be getting at not just what the Chinese government wants to do, but what the Chinese people are willing to support. And again, this is an argument I'm sure you've heard many times. I hear it often that China has a long history of being oppressed at various points in its history by Western powers. It's also done a lot of oppression of itself, but which often doesn't get as much attention. But there is nonetheless this history of oppression by Western powers that leads many people to reject Western values, I think, and to argue that China needs to operate by a different set of values in its own interest. And what's your reaction?
We can't change the past, okay? But we can change the future. If China let the people free to assess what kind of value they like, I'm sure they would like the value of the Western world, which protects the freedom and the dignity as a human being. Okay, I think the future is important. The past is dead.
Yeah, the past is dead, but it animates passions today, I think, in many people.
Yes, because China doesn't allow the people to assess the value outside.
Well, that's a really interesting point, and let me follow up on that, because there is a, well, correct me if you think I've got it wrong. My own impression, perhaps wrong, is that education in China cultivates the sense of a historical grievance, partly as a way to undermine the appeal of Western values, Western societies, also perhaps to cultivate a sense of patriotism. And then the opportunity for ordinary Chinese to learn a fuller view of history that's repressed through the control of the internet, through what's written in newspapers and so on. So I'm a little, partly for that reason, I'm a little less confident than you that if you just gave mainland Chinese folks the choice today, they would opt for Western values. They've been raised in a very different system.
If the Chinese open the information flow and have a free flow of information for the Chinese people to access, I'm sure the result is they will very quick assimilate to the outside world. But they're not giving this chance. And that's why the CCP has to control all the information coming from the outside, just because they are so afraid of it.
Yes, but that's
by closing the door, only by brainwashing, they know that they think that they can keep the stability of the country. In other words, only by making people stupid, they can rule them easier and having a greater stability than otherwise.
Yeah, so I agree with you that their actions reveal their fear of free access to information. I don't see any other way to interpret their actions. But as you said, and I think they believe, and they may even be right, that if they don't maintain that kind of barriers to information in the rest of the world that might put the CCP and the People's Republic of China in a less favorable light, the system will become unstable.
Right. Definitely.
So if that's the correct assessment, then the only way China maintains stability is by continuing to repress the flow of information. And they aren't going to be able to accommodate or assimilate into Western values because their system simply cannot survive that kind of openness. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think this is exactly what you said there. What's there? That's exactly, this is true, because they have to maintain a closet information system. and using the propaganda as a brainwash to keep people ignorant.
So Jimmy, what would you say? Let's say speak for a moment to, let's say, a Chinese national who is studying in university in the West.
Right.
What would you suggest they should go read, or what film should they go watch in order to educate themselves about the history of their own country? Kind of about part of their education that you think may have been missing. What would you recommend?
Well, I think if they live in the States, they just make friends with all the American students and all friends, and just live openly in the American society, watch the movies, read the books and all that. That will turn them into somebody else. But a lot of them are not willing to do so just because they fear if they do so, they go back to China, they will be punished. Because you know who's watching you.
Yeah, I think you're right. I see some of that hesitancy
yes.
among the Chinese nationals.
Or if you change into American culture person, you go back, maybe you cannot fit into the environment. Maybe people will not associate with you. A lot of grievances. Either we are being watched, or we eventually will go back and get punished, or I cannot be able to assimilate into the Chinese culture. And I think being a patriot, they also want to protect China whether China is right or wrong, they want to protect it.
Right.
That is expression of patriotism to a lot of Chinese students. You cannot blame them. That's the way they grow up. It's the way that they perceive that the identity as a Chinese belong to the Communist Party.
Yes. So Jimmy, let me ask you one more question. It's on a different topic, but I think it's a question again that is on many people's minds. So it says people argue that the movement in Hong Kong is inflamed by Hong Kong's income disparity, which is then channeled to anti-mainlanders, to be, I guess, anti-mainland. What's your view on that? In particular, what's your view on I guess, the economic side of discontent in Hong Kong? That what's fueling the protests?
Well, a lot of people have a very confused conception about Hong Kong people. They think Hong Kong people are just money, money, money. We are just money makers. But what the movement last year has shown to the world, we are not just money makers. We are people have souls too. We fight for our rule of law and freedom, and everybody can see it. And all the movement, we never ask for any economic issue. The 5 demands that we have are all surrounding universal suffrage, freedom of speech, about freedom. Nobody has ever had any issue with economic problem. Yes, there's disparity between the poor and the rich, but also the poor and the rich, they're not there all the time. Today I'm poor. I was poor before. Now I'm rich. Those rich on top, they're rich now, but they can drop off from the rich segment. So the whole poor and rich is a circulating movement. It's not a static status. So yes, there's a disparity, but there's also opportunities for people who work hard and consciousness and conscience to get.
So I hear you saying 2 things. One, the big income disparities, but there are opportunities, or there have been opportunities in the past.
Yeah.
But also, I thought you also made a broader point, which is Hong Kong people, the five demands, they weren't economic in nature. They were political in nature. And people in Hong Kong want those political freedoms, at least those who were supporting the protest movements.
Yes, exactly. And the disparity is not a static one. The disparity is a global one.
Well,
because the disparity, today I'm poor, tomorrow I'm rich. So the disparity is a moving circle.
Well, your life illustrates the movement from poor to rich. Maybe not everybody's that.
Quite a lot. If you look at the statistics, the people at the bottom 20% move away from it. Almost 90% of them move away from it in 10 years. Okay? But they won't be, very few will become as rich as I am, but they move up to the higher echelon.
And Jimmy, I think you've shown pretty clearly by your actions in recent years and even decades that you're motivated by much more than material well-being. I think anybody who knows even a little bit about your life story and your willingness to stand up for political liberty, free speech, and democracy, rule of law in Hong Kong recognizes that. I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I've certainly enjoyed speaking with you. I've learned from you.
No.
I'm sure that our listeners have as well. I also want to wish you well and your family well. You're dealing with some enormous challenges that you've taken upon yourself, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much.
Stay well, stay healthy, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.